On a cold morning in Europe, the doors of a livestock trailer swung open, and 7 wild horses stepped out onto a stretch of open grassland. Stocky, dun-colored with stiff upright manes and dark legs, they looked nothing like the tall riding horses in a paddock down the road. They stood still for a moment, tested the air, and then walked out into grass that had not felt a truly wild horse in longer than anyone could remember. The people who opened that trailer were mostly just hoping the horses would survive. 7 animals is a frighteningly small number to rebuild anything from. 1 hard winter, 1 outbreak of disease, 1 run of bad luck, and the whole thing could be over before it began. Nobody gave the horses a single instruction. Within weeks, they had started to change the ground beneath their hooves in ways the people watching had not thought to expect. I'm Robert Lane, and this is the story of how the wild horse vanished from Europe, how a handful of survivors were carried back onto the land, and what a returning grazer did to ground that had spent centuries growing over without it. Europe once had wild horses of its own. The Tarpan, the European wild horse, ranged across the grass and open woods of the continent for thousands of years, a small, tough, gray-brown animal with a dark stripe down its spine. Hunting and the spread of farmland wore it down, herd by herd, until the very last one died in captivity in the early 1900s. It had been shot for its meat and killed off as a pest, and the last animals died in menageries far from any wild herd. When that final mare died, the original wild horse of Europe was gone for good. Far to the east lived another kind of wild horse, and it is still with us. The Przewalski's horse is a stocky, sandy-coated animal of the Central Asian steppe, and it is the only horse on Earth that was never tamed. It carries 66 chromosomes, 2 more than every domestic horse, a sign of how separate its bloodline really is. By the late 1960s, hunting and the loss of grazing land had pushed even that horse out of the wild, and the last one seen roaming free in Mongolia simply vanished. The species survived only in a scatter of zoos. Every Przewalski's horse alive today descends from a founding group of just 12 to 16 animals. A Russian explorer had first brought the horse to the notice of Western science in the early 1880s, not long before it began to slip away. Careful breeding in zoos slowly pulled the numbers back, and more than 2,000 are alive today, with the largest herd in Europe out on the Hungarian plains. For the first time in a very long stretch of history, Europe had no wild horse left to work its open ground. That absence turned out to matter far more than anyone had assumed. A Dutch biologist named Frans Vera spent years arguing against a picture most people simply took for granted: the idea that Europe before farming had been one vast, closed, unbroken forest. Vera's case was that the old land had been something looser and more open than that, a shifting patchwork of grassy clearings and scattered groves, held open by the big grazing animals moving through it and eating it back. "Take those grazers out," he said, "and the open ground does not stay open. It thickens, scrubs over, and closes in, and the wildflowers and insects and birds that need sunlight disappear beneath it." It was a claim that could only be settled by putting the animals back and watching what they did, so people started putting them back. The most famous attempt began in the Netherlands on a flat expanse called the Oostvaardersplassen, ground reclaimed from the sea that industry had abandoned and wild birds had begun to take over. In 1983, on the strength of Vera's ideas, 18 Konik horses were turned loose there, a hardy, primitive breed from Poland, used across Europe as a living stand-in for the vanished Tarpan, alongside backbred cattle and red deer. They were set free across 56 square kilometers, and for years left almost entirely to themselves. Other countries tried the same thing with the last true wild horse. In 1993, 11 zoo-born Przewalski's horses were moved to a high limestone plateau in southern France to learn how to live wild again. In 1997, a founder herd was released onto the open grass plains of Hortobágy in Hungary, ground their distant ancestors had once grazed. In 1998, a group was let loose into the empty, radioactive country around Chernobyl, where no people were left to trouble them. And in 2023, a conservation team brought a small herd of Przewalski's horses to the scrubbed-over hills of central Spain. A wild horse is built for poor, rough forage, able to live on coarse grass that would leave other animals hungry, and it spends most of the day and much of the night eating, cropping the grass low. It will dig down through snow with its hooves to reach the forage underneath. Wild horses live in small bands, a single stallion holding a group of mares and their young, with the surplus young males running together in loose bachelor groups. They roll in dry dirt to clean their coats, wearing bare hollows into the ground, and they strip bark from the young trees. A horse grazes in a way that is different from a cow, and the two together open the ground in different ways, which is part of why the returning horse had an effect all its own. What the horses did was the part that caught everyone off guard. They grazed, hard and without pause. They cropped the tall, rank grass down to a low, tight sward. They bit back the young saplings and the creeping scrub before either could take hold. They broke paths through the thickets and pawed and rolled at the dry earth until they had worn open patches of bare ground. Where the grass had been one dense, uniform mass, a mixture appeared, short turf beside tall stems beside bare dust and open glade. That patchiness is what a whole range of smaller creatures needs to live, and it is exactly what a flat, uniform sward cannot give them. A horse grazes in a way that favors the wildflowers over the grasses, and in the gaps they opened, the flowers pushed back up. With the flowers came the insects, and behind the insects came the birds. On the Dutch polder, the open ground the horses and cattle held clear, pulled in a rush of rare wetland birds, spoonbills and bitterns and marsh harriers and kingfishers, exactly the sunlit, open country that Vera had promised they would make. In Spain, the horses set to work on land that farming had walked away from, eating down the heavy scrub that had grown across the abandoned fields and cutting into the very fuel that feeds the region's wildfires. Wild horses had grazed that Spanish country in the deep past, the same kind of animal painted on the cave walls at Altamira, and they had been gone from it for something like 4,000 years. In Hungary and around Chernobyl, the small founding groups grew into free-living herds, breeding and holding ground on grasslands their kind had not touched in centuries. In Hungary, the herd grew so well that managers eventually had to hold the numbers down, a happier problem than the one they started with, and the horses in the Chernobyl zone climbed past 100 animals in the land that people had fled. A careful study on the French plateau found that land grazed by horses held a wider range of plant life than land grazed by sheep, pushing the balance on that ground toward the wildflowers, the plants that so much other life depends on. Vera's open ground idea had been right. The grazer was the missing hand, and a wild horse rebuilt from barely more than a dozen animals was out doing a job across Europe that had stood empty for hundreds of years. It would be a lie to leave the story there, because the real picture is harder and stranger than a horse standing in a meadow. Start with the animals themselves. The Koniks on that Dutch polder are not the Tarpan brought back from the dead. They are a domestic breed chosen to stand in for it, and the belief that they somehow are the wild horse returned
has been pushed further than the science can support. The Przewalski's horse is a far truer wild animal, and yet even its claim to being purely wild is argued over by geneticists, and the whole species was forced through an opening so narrow that dozen or so founders that it still carries the damage. Inbreeding has left it with health problems and a low birth rate, and keeping it going means careful, hands-on management of which animal breeds with which.
And then there is what happened on the Oostvaardersplassen, which is the hardest part of the whole story. The experiment did prove Vera's point about open ground, but the land was fenced, it held no predator of any kind, and the horses had nowhere to migrate when the food ran short. So the herds did what any animals with abundant food and nothing checking their numbers will do. They grew well past what the ground could feed through a hard season, and the hard seasons came. The animals began to starve. Through the wet, bitter winter of 2017 and 2018, thousands of the horses, cattle, and deer died or were shot. Most of them culled on purpose once it was clear they would not survive to spring. The public was horrified. People climbed the fences to throw hay to the starving animals, and the police were sent to stop them. There were angry protests, debates in the Dutch parliament, and even death threats aimed at the scientists behind the work. In the end, the government abandoned the hands-off ideal completely. It ordered active management, culling the herds down to fixed target numbers and sending foresters out to check the condition of every large grazer, and it decided the Konik horses would be taken off that land, with a large group of the ponies shipped away to Belarus. The same experiment that had shown a wild horse could remake the ground had also shown, in the cruelest way, what happens when you seal one inside a fence with no way out. So the honest version sits between the triumph and the disaster, where there is real room and where the people involved manage the land with open eyes. The returning horse does genuine and valuable work. It opens up ground that is scrubbed over, brings grassland and wildflowers and birds back to places that had lost them, and can even take the edge off the wildfire risk that abandoned farmland builds. Where the horse is boxed in instead, handed no predators and no space, and then left alone, it can eat its way into a crisis that ends in starvation and a bitter public reckoning. It forced a hard question that rewilding keeps running into, whether an animal left to live and die entirely on its own terms is a wild creature or simply an abandoned one. That argument has run through European rewilding ever since, and it has never fully been put to rest. The effort has not stopped. The zoos that hold the last Przewalski's horses have kept flying them out to the open steppe, and in 2024, the first 7 were carried from Europe to the grasslands of Kazakhstan. The first wild horses to stand there in around 200 years. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A wild horse that Europe had erased, in one form long dead and in the other reduced to a dozen animals behind bars, is standing out on open European grass again, cropping the turf, breaking the scrub, and pulling the light-loving life back into places that had gone dark and overgrown. The horses can carry the grazing. They can do the ancient work of holding the land open, the work that went missing the day the wild horse disappeared. What they cannot do is make the hard choices about space and numbers and suffering that come with putting a large wild animal back into a crowded modern continent. Those choices stay with us. The land will answer the horse, the way it always has. Whether that answer is a thriving open country or a fenced field of starving animals depends far less on the horses than on the room, and the care we are willing to give them. If this story moved you, Tell me in the comments whether you think Europe should keep bringing its wild horses back. If it changed the way you think about what a single grazing animal can do to the land around it, share it with someone who would want to see it. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you would ever believe, and I have plenty more to tell you. I'm Robert Lane. Thanks for watching.